Greetings and welcome back to room 303 in the Harvard Classic Lectures. We are now in lecture number 100, and there's something fitting about our 100th lecture in the Harvard Classic Lectures will be Thoreau's Walden, and more particularly the very first chapter, Economy. Now, we've already given lectures on any number of topics that are going to be related, tangential to our discussion here. We, in lecture number 99, spent time with Thoreau's Walking, the famous essay about walking and the symbolism of living as walking. And then, of course, we've given large numbers of lectures on Emerson, transcendentalism, and any number of other topics, all accessible through the learnstrong.net site. Our goal here is the first of course, 18 total lectures to cover the 18 chapters of Walden. And we're going to jump right into this classic text, published after Thoreau spent 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days, of course, at Walden Pond. First published in 1854. I mean, think about that date, right? That is to say, Walt Whitman's Leaves of Grass is 1855. So it's an amazing time in American history, right, for publishing any number of challenging titles. Thoreau was at Walden, of course, the pond, from the 4th of July, as he will tell us right here in the opening chapter, 1845 to the 6th of September, 1847. Now, of course, we'll call it the year of Walden and put quotation marks around year, because it's actually, as we said, two years. But it's going to run from a summer, of course, July the 4th, to the fall, to the winter, and then finally to the spring and the concluding ideas of Walden itself, right? Everything, let's say it this way, everything is a metaphor in Walden of one kind or another. Now, let's review really quickly our 3 levels of reading where we will address this. That is to say, at level 1, what does the text say? At level 2, what does the text mean? 2A, themes, messages. 2B, rhetoric. Not what is said, but how Thoreau will say it. We're very interested in that. And then finally at level 3, how can I relate to this information in some meaningful way? At 3A, how can I relate to other texts? Of course, within the text, Walden itself, we'll be asking how this relates to earlier chapters that maybe we have looked at. And then finally, and most significantly, how can we relate this information to ourselves personally? We will, during our study of Walden, be as well messing around with, of course, our big 5, as we call it in 303. That is to say, what does this text say about epistemology and what one can know? What does this text say about ontology and who we are? What does this text say about psychology, the study of the individual mind and motivations that stand behind the decisions that we make individually? What does this text say about us sociologically? In other words, the analysis of not the individual but the group. And then finally, and this is significant in our study of Thoreau, what does this text say about theodicy, Theodicy? That is to say, the existence of pain and evil and suffering in the world. It will not be a huge shock when we say that Thoreau's going to say to us that we have to learn to not ask, why did this happen to me, but rather, why did this happen for me? This will be one of the great insights of Walden, among all the other insights of Walden. Now, let's go to work with economy really quickly. There are many who argue that if you're going to read Walden for the first time, you should skip over the first chapter, Economy, and jump to the second chapter, Where I Lived and What I Lived For, because there you're going to get into the real heart of the matter. We're going to disagree with this. We're going to argue that Thoreau knew what he was doing, and that he's going to open with his longest chapter, call it Economy, and it will appear at first maybe a throwaway chapter to a lot of readers, but I'm going to help, I hope, to be able to give you some sense of why Thoreau begins where he begins, and more importantly with this word economy, because it's going to be, like most words that Thoreau will use, a loaded word, right? Let's go ahead now and go right to it. Now let's review quickly. Thoreau's going to begin. Some will argue just directly to the point, outlining his 2-year project, of course, at Walden. Now, the pond is, of course, near Concord, right? It is, of course, land owned by Ralph Waldo Emerson. Thoreau takes a lot of heat for the fact that, he's a moocher, he's not really an independent liver and self-reliant as he proposes himself to be. We're going to sidestep a lot of these ideas to just look at the text and see what Thoreau says about his own experience and himself and, of course, those around. He says that he lived for 2 years and 2 months before he moved back to quote-unquote civilized society, right? That he makes the observation right away. This was an experiment. It wasn't like some kind of permanent thing he was doing. an experiment, if you will, in living. Now he's going to talk about the people who are around him and their reactions. It's a false reading, we're going to argue. It's a false reading to say of Thoreau that he was antisocial or he was anti-gregarious, he doesn't care about people and all that, he's a snob. None of that is even remotely true, and we're going to pick up on it here, right? However, there are people who are on the outside looking in, and obviously we as readers are to some degree the same, who kind of want to know what he's doing out there in the wilderness. Now, of course, to call it the wilderness is a little bit sketch because, I mean, you know, you could almost see Concord from where he's staying, right? So, at the pond. And yet, having said that, it is out in the woods, and of course, it's not in a nice, warm, cozy house he has to build it and all of that. Obviously, some people are worried as well about, he says, about his health and those kinds of things, right? And the fact that he's going out all by himself, right? It's clear, though, that he does see that maybe they're a little bit envious, like, dude, why do you get to go out and live all by yourself and we can't do that? Now, right away, very early in economy, he's going to get to the moral, as we might think of it, of this experiment of his, right? That is to say, he's going to talk about the beauty of the simplified life, right? And we're going to hear this all the way through. He's going to tell us that he is really talking about fundamental existence, right? Rudimentary, fundamental. In other words, what was the basics? We're going to hear in the second chapter about this, as he calls it, to live deliberately. Okay? He's going to argue that too many possessions require too much work to keep all of those possessions, and he's in some ways we're oppressed because of all of the stuff we have to own. I got to get a job because I have to have a vehicle. Why do you have to have a vehicle? So I can drive to school. Dude, you live 3 blocks away. Why don't you just walk? Yeah, but I don't want to walk. I want a vehicle. So in other words, wanting a vehicle now requires that you get a job, which means now you have no time to enjoy your life. It's going to be part of it, right? He will point out that people think they need to own things. This, of course, need to own things will mean they have to work all the time for it, so that ultimately they actually are owned by the things they own. That is to say, they lose their freedom, right? He will say that in some strange and interesting way, farmers who work the land are kind of chained to their farms, he will say. Almost like prisoners are chained up in their jail cell. Now, the hyperbole or the extreme metaphor, extreme observations are going to be a part of Thoreau. He was very influenced by his reading of Plato and, of course, the great Socrates, and we've given lots of lectures on Plato's sarcasm, his satire, his irony. We're going to see a lot of irony. I think oftentimes Thoreau's misread because he will speak ironically, and we're going to see this in our close reading here in a second of some of the lines, okay? He says, working beyond what's necessary will somehow chain people, right? And then he says, if you're faced with a choice between, on the one hand, increasing, your holdings, your means to, acquire some kinds of necessities, and limiting the amount of needs that you have, you should probably simplify and limit, limit the things that you need. I'll only talk about 4 needs. Now, obviously, one of the questions at level 3 we'll always ask is, would he have a different view if he was living today? He says, obviously you got to have food, obviously you got to have shelter, obviously you got to have clothing, and then you got to have, fuel, he says, to be able to exist. And since he says nature does much, right, to kind of give us all of these things, if a person is willing to accept these basic, he calls them gifts of nature, then you can basically live off the land and not have a lot of work involved in that. Now, we're going to hear about his work day of planting beans and taking care of bean fields, and we're going to hear, well, okay, so what are we talking about? Minimal toil or minimal work, right? He talks about luxury next, and this will sound very much like some of the comments that are made by Socrates in Plato's Republic about the ideal state and the whole notion of luxury. He says a lot of times luxury is a hindrance, and in fact, as Plato argued, luxuries can lead not to our improvement, but actually to our harm. He will then move on to talk about the construction of his little tiny house, his little cabin, and he's using this as an example of notions of simplicity, obviously self-reliance as well. Now, there's going to be obviously debate about, well, did he really build his own house? Well, he bought a house that was made up of some planks of wood. He cut down some trees in the wood for some of the major part of the hut, and then he bought a house and a little cabin, and then he took it apart and then he used the wood. So, you could make up your own mind. It obviously took him a while to be able to put all this together. He says he started with nothing, right? He even had to borrow an axe, he says. And he points out, after he borrowed the axe and he cut down some trees, that he was very much wanting to make sure that the axe was sharper than when he borrowed it, right? In other words, always make sure you're in debt to no one, self-reliance and all of that. He does say that he got some gifts, some supplies, you know, and he had to purchase a few things, and then he went to work, he says, slowly and steadily, right? And he worked through the spring, right, in those spring months to build his hut. He finally was ready to move in, July the 4th, 1845, the day of his own independence, as he will refer to it. And, of course, he was pretty jazzed about the experiences of what that meant, the accomplishment, we might say, of what that meant, right? He talks about the construction process and the agricultural challenges that had to follow, right? He keeps these books, these records, and this is going to take us back in our Harvard's Classics lectures to when we talked about Franklin and his autobiography. It is a tradition in American thought to keep very close records of what it is one does through journaling, through record keeping, charts, and all of the like. So he's got all of his little charts, and you're going to see this when you pick up, you know, economy and you look at it. It's really fun, right? All of the accounting, all the way down to half a penny, right, and all of that. He will talk about farming, and he'll talk about, you know, the investment. He calls it the $15 investment, and he's able to turn a profit of almost $9. So he is a capitalist in this regards, right? Okay. He does talk about his diet of beans. Now we're going to hear a lot about his lifestyle, especially about his diet through the course of Walden, and his vegetarianism, or was it vegetarianism? Because of course he did eat fish that he caught from Walden, but he talks about beans and corn and peas and potatoes. All of this obviously will sustain him, and then obviously he's selling some of this stuff to, you know, make a little bit of money, right? The review finally reveals that $62 of expenses during the first 8 months at Walden, offset you know, by a certain amount of $37 that was gained. And then finally at the end, a total cost, he says, of just over $25. He was able to get his house and the freedom to do whatever it is he wanted, and he considers it a great bargain. Now, that's the overview. When we pick up this text and we go to reading it, we have to enjoy the prose style of Thoreau. Now, we commented on this in our essay on Walking, lecture number 99, earlier in the Harvard Classics folder at learnstrong.net. Thoreau, or Emerson, in his essay about Thoreau, commented on the idea that Thoreau wrote the way he walked, with these long, smooth strides. And certainly when we pick up this and we read it, you know, and I wish I could just read every line of the economy with you, as I've often said in so many of my lectures of these longer titles. I wish I could just read it all to you, but I don't have the time. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share with you a few of my favorite lines. My hope in all of these lectures, obviously, is that you pick up the text and read it for yourself, at level 3 especially. Let's just enjoy a few lines. The opening few lines. He says, when I wrote the following pages, or rather the bulk of them, I lived alone in the woods, a mile from any neighbor, in a house which I built myself on the shore of Walden Pond in Concord, Massachusetts, and earned my living by the labor of my hands only. I lived there 2 years and 2 months. At present, I'm a sojourner in civilized life again. Now, the opening lines will in fact tell us that he's gonna speak directly to a sometimes skeptical reader. I mean, you can get this tone already, you know. It's like, oh boy, somebody's gonna roll their eyes because I decided to do this project. And so he says, yeah. Now I'm back, which will obviously beg the question, if it was so great to live in the woods at Walden Pond, why didn't you just stay there? There's, of course, a historical answer. He owed a debt to his pal Emerson, and he had to go back and help ostensibly raise Emerson's kids while Emerson was away on speaking tour in Europe. But there's obviously a deeper answer that he will give, and he will give it at the conclusion of Walden. He will say, you know, my life is not my life, it's lives, and I was only living one at Walden Pond. And of course, in all of this, he's challenging us to consider our life in similar ways. He said, I should not intrude my affairs so much on the notice of my readers if very particular inquiries had not been made by my townsmen concerning my mode of life, which some would call impertinent, though they do not appear to me at all impertinent, but considering the circumstances, very natural and pertinent. In other words, he says, I know that a number of you asked me about why I did this gig called living at Walden. Let me now explain it to you, right? Some have asked what I got to eat, if I did not feel lonesome, if I was not afraid, and the like. Others have been curious to learn what portion of my income I devoted to charitable purposes, and some who have had large families, how many poor children I maintain. I will therefore ask those of my readers who feel no particular interest in me to pardon me if I undertake to answer some of these questions in this book. Notice some will call it false modesty. It's a beautiful rhetorical technique of Thoreau. It is part of our epistemological understanding in the Big Five of epistemology of the fallibilist position. I think I'm right, but I could be wrong. It's that I could be wrong thing that often makes Thoreau so powerful to read. He'll come across as an absolutist, but there's always this, I'm going to share some ideas with you. What do you guys think? That kind of thing. I'll therefore ask my readers who feel no particular interest in me to pardon me if I undertake to answer some of these questions in this book. In most books, the I, or first person, is omitted. In this, it will be retained. That, in respect to egotism, is the main difference. Now, of course, we think about Walt Whitman immediately in his Leaves of Grass and Song of Myself, playing the exact same game of speaking directly to you, right? We commonly do not remember that it is, after all, always the first person that is speaking. I should not talk so much about myself if there was anybody else whom I knew as well. It's an interesting idea. Unfortunately, I'm confined to this theme by the narrowness of my experience. Moreover, I, on my side, require of every writer, first or last, a simple and sincere account of his own life, and not merely what he has heard of other men's lives, some such account as he would send to his kindred from a distant land, for if he has lived sincerely, it must have been in a distant land to me. Now, it's important, put it in your notes. Thoreau's going to challenge himself to provide an authentic report of his life, and in the process challenge us as livers and of course as thinkers and of course as writers to as well be as authentic as we can be. He says it this way, and the word perhaps will belie again this notion of his epistemological fallibility. Perhaps these pages are more particularly addressed to poor students. Of course, I see a few of you rolling your eyes, right? As for the rest of my readers, they will accept such portions as apply to them, I trust, that none will stretch the seams in putting on the coat, for it may do good service to him who fits it. Now, this putting on the coat is a wonderful word picture. We immediately think at 3A of T.S. Eliot's Long Song of Alfred Prufrock. I've seen the eternal footman hold my coat and snicker, and in short, I was afraid. That idea of when you put your hands in the sleeves, that's like putting on life itself. A few lines later, he'll say it this way: men labor under a mistake. Now, of course, as we said with walking, the word men here used obviously to mean both men and women. Thoreau, of course, is a great believer that women, and this was radical for his day, share with him the joy of curiosity, wonder, and exploration. Men labor under a mistake. The better part of a man is soon plowed into the soil for compost, but a seeming fate, commonly called necessity. They are employed, as it says in an old book, laying up treasures which moth and rust will corrupt and thieves break through and steal. In an old book, of course, is the book of the Gospels, of course, the Gospel of Matthew. That is to say, notice how there will be kind of an irreverence that often is tied with Thoreau's referencing any number of religious texts. It's a fool's life, as they will find when they get to the end of it, if not before. That notion, in other words, of live your life as best you can now. He continues by talking about public opinion. He says it's a weak tyrant compared with your own private opinion. What a man thinks of himself, that it is which determines, or rather indicates, his fate. A few lines later, as if you could kill time without injuring eternity. Now, I'm building my comments off of so many people who've influenced me. One of the things that anybody who studies Thoreau will always point out is how amazing he can construct these one-liners. I mean, look at that kind of a line. Next time you just waste your time, think of it. As if you could kill time without injuring eternity. And then he says it. One of the first most quoted lines from a book of so many quoted lines. The mass of men lead lives of quiet desperation. What is called resignation is confirmed desperation. And then a few lines later, when we consider what, to use the words of the Catechism, is the chief end of man, and what are the true necessities and means of life, it appears as if men had deliberately chosen the common mode of living because they preferred it to any other. Yet, they honestly think there is no choice left, but alert and healthy natures Remember that the sun rose clear. It's never too late to give up our prejudices. What a great line. It's never too late to give up our prejudices. In other words, epistemologically, if you're an absolutist and you know you're right and everybody else is wrong, how about just addressing the potentiality that what you think of as absolute is maybe just a prejudice? And it's time maybe to take a look at it. I mean, we say it this way in 303. You are the stories that we tell. We're the stories that we retell, the stories we accept. We're also the stories we reject, right? But of course, Thoreau's going to point it out time and again in Walden. Don't reject a story until you actually know that story, right? No way of thinking or doing, however ancient, can be trusted without proof. Now, this is huge. I mean, this is why we embrace, of course, is often referred to as the famous canon of the dead white males. Of course we will study them. Of course we'll read that. Thoreau is one of them, and he has said as much. If you're going to reject them, though, first of all, note, because often the very canons that would be rejected are canons that they themselves are quite radical, and he'll play the same game, right? What everybody echoes or in silence passes by as true today may turn out to be falsehood tomorrow, mere smoke of opinion, which some have trusted for a cloud that would sprinkle fertilizing rain on their fields. What old people say is, what a great line, what old people say, you cannot do you, what old people say, you cannot do, you try and find that you can. In other words, lots of people will tell you what you can do, and then you turn around and prove them wrong. Old deeds for old people and new deeds for new, he says. Age, a few lines later, is no better, hardly so well qualified for an instructor as youth, for it has not profited so much as it has lost. One may almost doubt that the wisest man has learned anything of absolute value by living. And then he says, I've lived some 30 years on this planet, and I've yet to hear the first syllable of value or even earnest advice from my seniors. Well, obviously this is hyperbole or exaggeration, because obviously he was very influenced by what Emerson had to say. But the point is this, and Whitman will make the same point in Leaves of Grass time and again. As young people, listen to what the older have to say.